The late afternoon sun filtered softly through the windows of the classroom, casting a warm golden glow on the worn wooden desks. Sophie Bennett, a 28-year-old high school teacher, sat at the front of the room, her fingers drumming absently on the edge of her desk. The school day had come to an end, and most of the students had left for the day. But Sophie wasn't in any rush to go home. Her husband Lucas had been working late again, and lately, Sophie found herself stuck in a routine that seemed too predictable, too mundane. The days blurred together. Teaching, grading, and maintaining the facade of a perfect marriage. But there was an emptiness that tugged at her. A sense that something vital was missing from her life, though she couldn't quite pinpoint what it was. As she gathered her papers, she heard the door creak open. Looking up, she saw Ethan Jacobs standing there, his usual quiet presence filling the doorway. Ethan, a 17-year-old senior in her English class, had always been a bit of a loner. He was sharp, intelligent, but withdrawn. Sophie had noticed him more than once, sitting at his desk, his eyes focused not just on the lesson but on her. It wasn't uncomfortable, but there was an undeniable intensity in the way he looked at her, something that tugged at the corners of her mind. "Miss Bennett," he said softly, his voice almost shy, "I was wondering if I could ask you a few questions about the assignment." Sophie smiled, offering a nod. "Of course, Ethan. Come on in." She motioned for him to sit across from her at the desk, and she watched as he slowly made his way to the chair, his movements deliberate, careful. Sophie couldn't help but notice how different Ethan was from the other students. His hair was slightly tousled, his clothes simple, but he had an air of something deeper, something more than just a high school student. As she explained the assignment, their conversation shifted from the academic to something more personal. Ethan seemed eager to speak with her, as though he were waiting for an opening. "I've been thinking about the themes in The Great Gatsby," he said, tapping his pen nervously against his notebook. "You know, the whole idea of unattainable dreams. It's like, sometimes it feels like we're all just reaching for something that's just out of our grasp." Sophie paused, intrigued. Most of her students weren't that introspective, but Ethan had always struck her as different. "I think I understand what you mean," Sophie replied, leaning forward slightly. Gatsby's dream was about more than just wealth. It was about love, longing, something beyond the tangible. But it was also something he could never fully have. Ethan looked up, meeting her gaze for the first time since they'd started talking. There was a moment of silence, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Sophie's heart skipped a beat. It was as if he wasn't just talking about the book anymore. There was something else in his words, something that felt too personal to ignore. "I guess we're all just trying to reach for something we can't have," he said, his voice low, almost vulnerable. Sophie swallowed, a tight knot forming in her throat. She had never heard Ethan speak like this before, so open, so raw. It made her feel exposed, as if he could see right through her carefully constructed walls. She didn't know what to say, so she simply nodded, trying to regain her composure. "Well," she said, clearing her throat, "it's important to keep striving for something, even if it feels out of reach. That's the only way we grow, right?" Ethan smiled, but there was a sadness in his eyes that caught her off guard. "Right," he murmured, looking down at his notebook. Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that their conversation had shifted in some subtle way. There was a connection now, something she hadn't expected. It wasn't just about teaching anymore. There was something deeper, something unspoken that hung in the air between them. As the minutes ticked by, Sophie became aware of how close they were sitting. Ethan's presence was overwhelming in a way she hadn't anticipated. He wasn't like the other students, asking for help with a paper and then rushing off. No, Ethan lingered, and it felt different. His quiet intensity seemed to draw her in, and despite her better judgment, Sophie found herself giving him more attention than she normally would have. Finally, Ethan stood up, pulling his bag over his shoulder. "Thanks for the help," he said, his voice softer than usual. "No problem," Sophie replied, her voice betraying her unease. "Good luck with the assignment, Ethan." As he turned to leave, Sophie felt an odd flutter in her chest. She pushed the feeling aside, telling herself it was nothing, just the result of a long day, of too many hours spent at school. But deep down she knew it was more than that. Ethan paused at the door and turned back to her. "Ms. Bennett," he said, his eyes lingering on her a moment longer than usual. I think I think I understand why Gatsby never gave up on his dream. He just didn't know when to let go. Sophie felt her breath catch in her throat. She knew that look. It was the same look he had given her all along. An unspoken invitation, a dangerous pull. But she couldn't let herself acknowledge it, not yet. "Good night, Ethan," she said, forcing a smile. He nodded and left the room. Sophie stayed behind, staring at the door for a moment before slowly walking to her desk. Her heart was pounding, her mind spinning. She had no idea what to make of the strange tension that had settled between them, but she couldn't deny that something had shifted. Something was starting, and Sophie wasn't sure if she was ready for it. The days after that conversation with Ethan felt like they stretched on forever. Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them. It wasn't anything overt, no words, no gestures, but there was a subtle tension in the air, something that lingered in the corners of the classroom when he looked at her, something that seemed to echo in her mind long after their encounters. She tried to focus on her work, on her marriage, on her routine. Lucas had been distant lately, caught up in work and his own distractions, leaving Sophie to navigate her emotions alone. There were nights when he'd come home late, barely acknowledging her presence before retreating to his office. Sophie couldn't remember the last time they had really talked, really connected. But Ethan was different. She couldn't stop thinking about the way he spoke to her that day. How his words felt almost like a confession. He'd revealed a part of himself that made her feel like she was seeing him for the first time, and it had unsettled her in ways she hadn't expected. It was the following Wednesday when their next interaction came. The school day had ended, and Sophie was finishing up a stack of grading papers when she saw Ethan standing outside her classroom door again, his hand resting lightly on the handle, as if he were unsure whether to enter. He looked hesitant, a little more vulnerable than usual. Sophie paused for a moment, wondering if she should just let him go. But the curiosity, no, the pull was too strong. "Ethan," she called, her voice just above a whisper. He glanced up, surprised to hear her voice, and stepped into the room. There was an awkward silence before he spoke. I'm sorry if I made you uncomfortable the other day," Ethan said, his voice low, almost uncertain. Sophie's heart raced and she forced herself to smile, trying to calm the rising tension. "You didn't make me uncomfortable. It's just, well, it was an unexpected conversation," she replied, her voice betraying a hint of nervousness she hadn't meant to show. He nodded, as if processing her words, before sitting down across from her at the desk, his usual reserve replaced by something a little more raw. There was something in his eyes, something that made Sophie's breath hitch. "Can I ask you something?" Ethan said, his gaze steady. Sophie swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his stare. "Of course," she said, keeping her voice steady despite the growing unease. "Do you ever feel like you're stuck?" Ethan asked. "Like you're doing all the right things but nothing feels real anymore?" Sophie blinked, caught off guard. The question was so personal, so far removed from their usual academic interactions. She had spent years teaching students about literature, philosophy, and life, but here was Ethan, asking her a question that seemed to penetrate deeper than any lesson she had ever given. Sophie hesitated. She was about to speak, to give him the professional answer, the one that came from years of experience as a teacher. But instead, she found herself being honest in a way she hadn't expected. "Yes, sometimes I feel like that. I get lost in the routine, in the expectations, and forget what it is that I truly want." Ethan's eyes softened, and Sophie could see a flicker of understanding in them. He wasn't just speaking abstractly anymore. He was speaking to her, in a way that felt intimate, like a thread connecting them. "It's like we're both just pretending," Ethan said, his voice quiet. "Pretending that everything's okay when it's not." Sophie's heart skipped a beat. The words felt like a confession, like he was revealing something he hadn't meant to. The intensity of their conversation, the rawness of it, took her breath away. Before Sophie could respond, there was a knock at the door, sharp and sudden, breaking the moment. "Miss Bennett," a voice called from the hallway. "Are you still here?" Sophie quickly straightened up, her hands betraying her sudden tension as she cleared her throat. "Yes, I'm just finishing up here. I'll be right out," she called, her voice more firm than she intended. Ethan stood up, his expression unreadable now. "I should go," he said, his tone distant. "I don't want to keep you." Sophie nodded. feeling a strange pang of disappointment at the abrupt end to their conversation. "It's fine. Take care, Ethan." He paused by the door, his hand resting on the handle, before turning to look at her one last time. "I meant what I said," Ethan said softly. "About feeling stuck. I think you understand." Sophie's pulse quickened. She wanted to say something to reach out to him to stop him from leaving. But she didn't. Instead, she stood frozen, watching as he walked out of the room, his steps echoing down the hall. As the door clicked shut behind him, Sophie was left standing there, her heart pounding in her chest. The conversation, the connection, lingered in the air long after Ethan had gone. She had told herself it was nothing, just a student seeking guidance. But deep down she knew it was something more. Something dangerous. She glanced down at her hands, feeling the weight of the moment settle around her. It wasn't just Ethan who felt stuck. It was her too. And she wasn't sure how much longer she could ignore the pull. The line between teacher and student was supposed to be clear, but now it felt blurred. And Sophie wasn't sure where it would take her next. The week passed slowly for Sophie, her mind constantly returning to the conversation with Ethan. His words had hit her harder than she expected, and the pull she felt toward him was undeniable. Every time she saw him in class, it was harder to maintain professional distance. His smile lingered a little too long, his gaze more intense than necessary. There was something in the air when he was around, something that made her heart race. Thursday arrived and Sophie was at her desk, organizing papers after class when she noticed Ethan standing by his classroom door, as if waiting for someone. Their eyes met, and Sophie felt a jolt of electricity run through her. She couldn't explain it, but it was as if the world had paused, just for that brief moment. "Miss Bennett," Ethan called softly, his voice low and warm. "Can we talk for a minute?" Sophie hesitated for a moment, then nodded, her heart skipping a beat. She wasn't sure if she should walk away, but instead she found herself moving toward him. It was as if her feet were acting on their own. Ethan stepped aside and gestured for her to enter. The classroom was quiet, only the two of them now in the dim space. The tension between them was palpable, an unspoken awareness that neither of them acknowledged directly. Sophie sat at the desk he offered, trying to appear calm, though she could feel her pulse quickening. "I wanted to go over some things about the class," Ethan said casually, pulling out a paper. But Sophie wasn't really listening. She couldn't focus on the lesson material. She was too aware of his presence, of how close he was, how the air between them felt thick and charged. Ethan began explaining something about the class, but Sophie barely heard it. All she could think about was the way his hand brushed against hers when he handed her a paper. A simple gesture, but it felt like a spark. His touch lingered just a moment too long, and she pulled her hand back quickly, feeling the heat rise to her face. Their eyes met again, and this time Ethan's gaze was steady, searching. It wasn't the look of a teacher anymore, but something more personal, more intimate. Sophie felt the walls she had built between them beginning to crumble. "Sophie," Ethan's voice broke through her thoughts. "I've been thinking about what you said. About feeling stuck." Sophie swallowed, her throat dry. She wasn't sure where this conversation was headed, but she could feel the weight of his words. "What do you mean?" Ethan leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping lower. "We're both in a place where we're not fully happy. We keep doing what's expected of us, but I don't think either of us is fulfilled. Don't you feel that?" Sophie's heart skipped a beat. She couldn't deny it. She had been feeling lost, disconnected from everything. Her work, her life, even her marriage. The idea that Ethan felt the same way was almost too much to bear. I don't know what to say," Sophie murmured, her fingers trembling slightly. Ethan gave her a soft, understanding smile. "I know this is complicated, but I can't stop thinking about you, Sophie. I just wanted you to know that." His words hit her like a shockwave. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to say something to push back, but she couldn't form the words. She wasn't sure if she wanted to reject him, or if on some deeper level she wanted to give in. This is wrong," she whispered almost to herself. Ethan didn't pull back. Instead, he leaned a little closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "I know, but it feels real, doesn't it?" Sophie nodded, her breath shallow. "I don't know what to do with this connection." I don't know either, Ethan said softly. But I can't ignore it. The air between them was thick with unspoken desire. Sophie could feel the pull, the temptation to give in. But she also knew the consequences. This was dangerous. It was wrong. Yet, every part of her was telling her to stay, to explore this connection. Just as Sophie opened her mouth to speak, there was a knock at the door. Sophie, you still in there? A colleague's voice called from the hallway. Sophie jumped, her heart pounding in her chest. She stood up quickly, her mind racing. She couldn't be alone with Ethan any longer. This wasn't just a conversation anymore. It was something more. Something she wasn't ready to confront. I have to go, Sophie stammered, her voice shaky. She turned toward the door, her hands trembling as she gripped the handle. This can't happen. Ethan didn't stop her, but his eyes held a quiet intensity. I understand, he said softly, his gaze lingering on her as she left. As Sophie stepped into the hallway, she felt her world tilt. She knew that something had shifted between them, and she wasn't sure if she could undo it. She wasn't sure if she wanted to. The following days were a blur for Sophie. Her mind replayed the conversation with Ethan, and she couldn't escape the lingering feeling of his gaze. No matter how hard she tried to focus on her work or her marriage, everything seemed to lead back to him. She knew she should keep her distance, but every encounter with him felt like a magnetic pull she couldn't resist. One afternoon, Sophie was sitting in her office, trying to concentrate on grading papers, when she heard a soft knock on the door. Her heart skipped. She wasn't expecting anyone, but she knew who it was before she even turned around. Ethan, she said, her voice betraying a hint of surprise and nervousness. Sorry to bother you, Ethan said, stepping inside. I just wanted to make sure we're still on for the meeting tomorrow about the curriculum. Sophie nodded, trying to mask her unease. Yes, of course. Same time. Ethan smiled, but it was a little different this time, softer, almost too intimate. Same time. I'll see you then. He lingered by the door, and for a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was thick, charged with unspoken words. Sophie felt her breath catch in her throat. Ethan, Before she could finish, Ethan closed the door gently behind him and took a step toward her. Sophie, he interrupted, his voice low, almost a whisper. You don't have to say anything. Sophie's pulse quickened as she took an instinctive step back. But Ethan was already too close. He reached out, lightly touching her arm. The contact was brief, but it sent a shock of heat through her. Her mind screamed for her to pull away, to stop this, but her body betrayed her. Her heart raced as she met his gaze, and for a fleeting moment, everything else melted away. You don't understand, Ethan, Sophie murmured, her voice trembling. This is wrong. He didn't move, but his eyes softened. I know, he said, his voice full of understanding. But you're not the only one feeling this way. Sophie's breath caught. She wanted to argue, to tell him how dangerous this was, but something in his expression made it impossible. It was as if they were the only two people in the world, and nothing else mattered. I can't stop thinking about you, Ethan admitted, his voice steady but filled with desire. It's not just the physical attraction. There's something more between us. Sophie's heart raced, and her stomach tightened with a mix of longing and guilt. She could feel the weight of his words sinking into her, stirring emotions she wasn't ready to confront. You have to stop, Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible. This can't go any further. Ethan's expression faltered for a moment, but then he stepped back, giving her space. I'm not going to push you, he said, his tone softer now. But I won't pretend that nothing's happening here. Sophie closed her eyes, trying to collect her thoughts. I'm married, she finally said, her voice breaking slightly. I have a life outside of this. I know, Ethan replied quietly. But that doesn't change how I feel. Sophie's head spun. She didn't know how to feel, what to do next. All she knew was that every moment with him, every touch, was starting to break down the walls she had built around herself. She wasn't sure how much longer she could resist. Tomorrow, Ethan said, his voice distant now. We'll talk about the curriculum. But I don't think this is over, Sophie. Sophie nodded, feeling a lump in her throat. She watched him walk out of the room, leaving her with the deafening silence of her thoughts. As the door clicked shut behind him, Sophie slumped into her chair, her hands trembling. She couldn't ignore it any longer. What was happening between them was real. And no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't stop herself from falling deeper into it. The days after Ethan's visit felt like a storm was building inside Sophie. She couldn't escape the thoughts of him. His smile, the softness in his voice, the way his touch lingered even after he'd left her office. It was all she could think about. But at the same time, every part of her screamed that this was wrong, that she should step away. It was late Thursday evening when Sophie sat on the couch, flipping through a book, but her mind was elsewhere. She had tried to focus on her husband Jack, who had come home early for dinner, but her thoughts kept drifting back to Ethan. Jack noticed the distance. "You okay?" he asked, breaking the silence. He placed his plate down on the coffee table and sat next to her. Sophie turned to him, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just tired." Jack raised an eyebrow. He had known Sophie long enough to know when something was off. "You sure? You've been distant lately. Is something going on at work?" Sophie's heart raced. She didn't know how to answer him without lying, and she didn't want to hurt him either. She tried to ignore the guilty pang in her chest. "It's nothing. I'll be fine," Sophie said, her voice shaky. Jack didn't seem convinced but let it go. The conversation moved on to other topics, but Sophie's mind remained a million miles away. Later that night, after Jack fell asleep, Sophie found herself unable to relax. She tossed and turned in bed, her thoughts spiraling. She grabbed her phone, mindlessly scrolling through social media, but her screen lit up with a new message, an unknown number. Her pulse quickened as she read the message. "I can't stop thinking about you, Sophie." It was from Ethan. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. Her heart raced as she stared at the screen, her mind running a million miles an hour. This wasn't just a random message, it was a sign. The connection she had been denying, the attraction that had been building between them was real. "We need to talk," the message continued. "I know this isn't easy, but I can't ignore this anymore. I know you feel it too." Sophie stared at the text, her fingers hovering over the keys. She could feel the weight of her emotions, the pull of Ethan's words, and the fear of what this meant for her life. But at the same time, a part of her knew she had to reply. She had to confront what was happening between them. "I'm married. I can't keep doing this." She typed the words slowly, her finger trembling as she hit send. The message felt final, like a plea for distance, but it also felt like an acknowledgement of the tension they shared. She waited for a response, her heart pounding in her chest. When her phone buzzed again, she felt a rush of anticipation. "I understand, but I won't pretend this isn't real. I'll be here when you're ready." Sophie sank back into her pillow, staring at the ceiling. His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The conversation had changed everything. She had opened a door she couldn't close, and now she didn't know how to walk away from it. She wanted to feel regret, to tell herself she was overreacting, but deep down, Sophie knew there was no turning back. Ethan had already crossed into her world, and there was no going back from that. The next morning, she walked into work with a tight knot in her stomach. She couldn't avoid Ethan forever, and she knew that today would be the day they would have to confront what was happening. No more pretending. Sophie tried to focus during the meeting, but she couldn't shake the feeling of his eyes on her, the intensity of his gaze from the night before. She could almost feel him standing beside her just out of reach. And when their eyes met across the room, it was as if the world had disappeared, leaving only the two of them. The silence between them was charged with everything unspoken, and Sophie knew the moment they left the meeting, they would have to face what was between them. The tipping point had arrived. Episode 6, The Moment of Truth. Sophie walked into the office early the next day, her steps hesitant as she approached her desk. The events of the previous night were still vivid in her mind. The tension in her body, the weight of the messages, the unanswered questions. She tried to push them aside, but each step felt like a burden, each breath too shallow. Her heart raced as she spotted Ethan across the room. He was already there, sitting at his desk, but his eyes were fixed on her. The air between them crackled with something unspoken, something neither of them was ready to acknowledge. Sophie took a deep breath and focused on her work, trying to stay professional, trying to ignore the pull she felt. But it was impossible. Every glance he threw her way seemed to linger, and every word she spoke felt inadequate in the face of the emotions swirling inside her. By noon the office was quieter. Everyone else had gone to lunch, leaving Sophie and Ethan alone. The sudden silence in the room felt like an invitation. He stood up from his desk and walked toward her, his movements slow but deliberate. "Can we talk?" Ethan asked, his voice low, but filled with something Sophie couldn't quite place. Sophie's breath caught. She hadn't expected him to approach her so directly so soon. She glanced around the empty office, feeling a surge of anxiety, but at the same time, her body was pulling her toward him. "Ethan, we shouldn't," she began, her voice shaky, but he didn't let her finish. He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "I can't pretend this isn't happening anymore," he said softly. "You can feel it too. The tension between us. It's real." Sophie's chest tightened. She wanted to protest, to pull away, but she couldn't. His words, his proximity, everything about him was pulling her in. And the harder she tried to resist, the stronger the pull became. "I don't know what you want from me," Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible. Her hands trembled as she clasped them in front of her. Ethan took a step closer, his face inches from hers. "I don't want anything from you, Sophie. I just want to understand what's happening between us. I can't deny this connection any longer." Her heart raced, her pulse thudding in her ears. She could feel the heat of his breath on her skin, his gaze searching hers for some sign, some indication that she felt the same way. She had always been strong, always been in control of her emotions. But in that moment, Sophie felt like she was drowning. "I'm married," she whispered, the words feeling heavy on her tongue. But even as she said them, she knew they didn't feel real. They didn't feel like enough to push him away. Ethan reached out, gently cupping her chin in his hand. "I'm not asking you to forget your life, Sophie. I'm just asking for the truth. Do you feel it too?" Sophie closed her eyes, feeling the pressure of his touch. She wanted to say no, to deny the connection that had been building between them, but her heart betrayed her. She couldn't lie to him, not when every part of her wanted to answer with the truth. Her eyes fluttered open, and their gazes locked. She could see it in his eyes, the same yearning, the same tension that had been building between them. She couldn't deny it any longer. But before she could speak, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall, and both of them froze. Sophie stepped back instinctively, as if the world had suddenly returned to reality. Ethan didn't move, but the moment was broken, and the tension in the air evaporated. Sophie turned away quickly, her heart still racing. "We can't do this," she said, her voice shaky but firm. Ethan's gaze never left her, but he nodded slowly. "I know, but you'll have to decide what you really want, Sophie. I can't do this alone." With that, he turned and walked back to his desk, leaving Sophie standing there, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. She couldn't ignore it any longer. The connection, the feelings, it was all too real. But was she willing to risk everything for it? Was she willing to sacrifice her life, her marriage, for something that was so forbidden, so dangerous? As she sat at her desk, trying to steady her breath, Sophie realized that she had reached the point of no return. She was standing on the edge, and there was no turning back. The days that followed were a blur for Sophie. She couldn't focus at work, couldn't breathe without feeling the weight of Ethan's words hanging over her. The temptation was unbearable, and every moment she spent away from him felt like an eternity. But she had her family, her husband Ben. He deserved more than this. Sophie had spent years building a life with him, a life that was now teetering on the edge of collapse. Every glance at Ben made her feel guilty, as if she was betraying everything they had built. But every time she saw Ethan, her resolve cracked just a little more. One evening, as Sophie sat at the dinner table with Ben, her mind was a million miles away. Ben had been talking about a new project at work, but she wasn't listening. All she could think about was the way Ethan had looked at her earlier that day, how his presence had consumed her. "Earth to Sophie," Ben's voice cut through her thoughts, and she blinked, startled. "You okay? You've been distant lately." Sophie tried to smile, but it felt forced. "Yeah, just tired," she muttered, pushing her food around her plate. She couldn't bring herself to meet Ben's eyes. He was too trusting, too unaware of the storm brewing inside her. Later that night, after Ben had fallen asleep, Sophie lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Her mind replayed every conversation, every look, every touch with Ethan. She could feel his presence even now, like an invisible force pulling her toward him. But the weight of her marriage, of everything she would lose, kept her trapped. The phone on her nightstand buzzed, startling her. She reached for it, heart racing as she saw Ethan's name flash across the screen. "Ethan, I need to see you. Now." Sophie hesitated. She knew what this was. The temptation, the moment of no return. But she couldn't fight it any longer. Without thinking, she typed back, "Sophie, I'll be there in 20 minutes. She got out of bed quietly, making sure not to wake Ben. Her heart was pounding in her chest as she grabbed her coat and slipped out of the house. The cold air hit her face as she walked to her car, her thoughts in a haze. Was she really doing this? Was she really going to betray everything? She arrived at Ethan's apartment, her hands shaking as she knocked on the door. The moment he opened it, she could feel the electricity between them. There was no more hiding, no more pretending. "I knew you'd come," Ethan said, his voice low, filled with something dangerous. Sophie stepped inside, closing the door behind her. She didn't say a word, her breath catching in her throat. Ethan closed the distance between them, his hands gently cupping her face. His lips hovered just inches from hers. "Sophie," he whispered, his voice a mixture of need and tenderness. "You don't have to say anything. I just need to know if you're with me." Her pulse raced, every inch of her body screaming at her to stop, to turn around, to walk away. But she couldn't. She couldn't fight it any longer. Without another word, she kissed him. And in that moment, everything changed. There was no going back now.